should you buy or invest in I guess we're kind of talking about rental properties here. Should you buy or invest in a rental property that is cheaper with higher returns or more expensive with lower returns? Well, the answer is it depends. First thing you need to understand is the returns are projected. So if you find a rental property and it's making X number in rent a month and your expenses or whatever, so your cash flow is whatever, that is projected. It is not guaranteed. And that's going to come into play when we talk about the cheaper property, all properties, but cheaper properties especially. So the thing to understand is that it's projected numbers, but projected, the question remains nonetheless, cheaper property with higher projected returns or more expensive property with lower projected returns. Why is that dynamic the case? It may not always be, but for the most part it should be, because you're getting a trade-off. It's all going to come down to risk. So if you're taking on a cheaper property, and depending on what price range we're talking about, but generally speaking, if you take on a cheaper property, your risk is going to be higher. That is why your projected income or returns are supposed to be higher. Essentially, they're going to make up, supposedly, for taking on that higher risk. Higher return, higher risk. Higher risk, higher return, whichever way you want to look at it. In theory, if you pay more for a nicer property, you're getting lower returns, but in theory, your risk is lower. There's no guarantee on any end of the spectrum. If you buy a really cheap distressed property, it's not a guarantee that you're going to have a terrible tenant. It's just that the chances are higher. If you buy a really nice property, it's not a guarantee that you're going to get the nicest tenant who takes care of everything to high quality. It's just that the chances are higher that that's what you're going to get. So when you're comparing these options, the first thing you want to think about is your own personal risk aversion or comfort levels. Like, are you an adrenaline junkie? I hadn't really thought about adrenaline junkies, but maybe you're an adrenaline junkie and you want to try your hand at the cheaper property with the higher possible returns. Or maybe you're an experienced investor and you have a pretty good handle on either how to landlord, or you just kind of understand the dynamics better. So your risk with those might be lower because you kind of know what you're doing, versus a brand new rental property owner who probably doesn't know most of what they're doing. That those are two very different people taking on that risk. So that risk level is going to be different for those two people because of your skill level. Do you have a corporate job and 5 kids and a family, and you just want to do something smart with your money and not have any headaches? Well, then you probably want to be thinking about the nicer property. So assess it compared to your own personal situation, your own goals. If cash flow is king and you want to do this full time or whatever, cool, go for the cheaper property. But if this is a side time thing, and or you have a pretty big aversion to risk, then you want to think about nicer. So some of the qualities that can happen when we're talking about like high quality tenants versus low quality tenants, again, not a guarantee of who's going to end up in which property, but we're increasing our chances one way or the other. Bad tenants. In my experience, bad tenants have been the most costly thing on my rental properties. The turnovers end up insanely expensive. It's almost baffling how much a bad tenant can cost you. And that's just the turnover. If they stop paying rent, then you have vacancy months. If you have eviction fees, depending on what state you're in, that can be terrible. It's just, bad tenants can be terrible. Not good or bad tenants, but you also want to think about the longevity of how long a tenant's going to be there, because that's that many less turnovers that you're going to have to deal with. So that's significantly less cost. Typically, lower quality tenants aren't going to stay. They're going to be more transient. In theory, you could have someone in a property for 20 years and they destroy it. But, like versus like, let's say you have a really nice single family house near good schools and whatever, you might attract a family who stays there while they raise their kids. Who knows? Again, this is going to be dependent on location. It depends on the neighborhoods we're talking about. There's so many different variables, but the idea for this video is to just kind of talk about at high level, so you kind of know generally what you're thinking of. So one example of the cheaper property, for example, I live in Los Angeles, and one of the only affordable places one of the only places that you could get even something close to cash flowing, and that's if it even cash flows, is Compton. Although I hear Compton's actually kind of building up now, but Compton. And when I first started getting into investing, and this was 9 years ago, I don't know the exact status of Compton right now, but I met some local LA investors and they said, yeah, you can totally get a fourplex in Compton, decently affordable. And, you might even break even maybe a smidge of cash flow every month. I was like, really? Well, that sounds cool because it also sounds rebellious to invest in Compton. They're like, yeah, but there's one little hitch to it. I was like, what's the hitch? And they said, you would never be able to go to the property. I was like, what do you mean I couldn't go? It's my property. And they're like, yeah, you wouldn't want to do that. And in the area that they were talking about where these properties were, there are property managers who specifically manage just these properties because they know how to do it. They absolutely keep guns on them, but it's a situation where, little Joe Blow new investor like, oh goody, I got a property. You can't show up in these properties if you want to stay safe. It's dangerous areas. And so, that it was like, interesting compared to a nicer property in LA that nothing really is going to cash flow. But, do I want to take on that risk? And that's a much more extreme, dramatic example of the cheaper properties. But there is if you go really cheap on properties, there are specific skills. I know some people, some investors, very successful investors who only invest in the cheaper, distressed, not so good area properties, and they are incredibly profitable. But one thing that I learned from them is that there is a specific skill set in how to properly manage those properties. And it is different than your, little single family, nice house, suburban, whatever. And so if you have that skill set, it absolutely can be profitable. It's not to say that cheaper, lower quality properties can never be profitable. They totally can. But if you're this brand new investor, you have to understand that that is a different skill set. I mean, it's got a lot of the same whatevers, but there's a whole different list of things that you need to understand and to be able to manage in such a way in order to make that property work. And that's the key, is that those skills are not to just keep the property going, it's how to make that property successful and profitable. So back to the bigger question. Do you buy the cheaper property with higher projected returns, or do you buy the nicer property with lower projected returns? First of all, it's going to depend on your personal situation, which one fits better for you. Number two, it's going to depend on your skill level. If you're a brand new investor, I personally would discourage you from going to the lower end property. Start with a higher end, get your feet wet. And if you feel like you kind of have a handle on it, start taking on more risk. The whole idea with this is risk. If you're very clear on risk and you're very clear on mitigations for risk, which are a lot more on the cheaper properties, cool, do it. But typically, new investors don't understand those clearly enough, the risk and the mitigations for the risk, in order to make something like that work. You have risk anyways on the nice property. Learn how to deal with that level of risk and learn due diligence, learn managing tenants or property managers, however you have it set up. Learn all of that first when that risk level isn't quite as high. I have some really nice properties and I've ended up with some terrible tenants before. It's even the nice properties are going to be learning experiences. So be careful throwing yourself into the deep end. And again, this is a very generic kind of premise because what constitutes like a cheap property is going to vary between states, between markets, cheap versus whatever. On any of the properties you're talking about, you want to make sure there's some level of projected cash flow. Like we're not talking like A grade, nicest home, A grade schools all the time, because those aren't probably even going to cash flow. So we're talking more of kind of like the middle of the spectrum comparison, like maybe B grade properties, B grade neighborhoods versus like D grade. So understand what comes with, and it's really as simple as understanding the general risks in rental properties, which I will put a link in the comments. I hadn't thought about that. I'll put a link in the comments to an article I wrote about kind of breaking down these risks. If you understand the general risk to rental properties, you'll really kind of start to see how those tie into the different property types. So again, very generic premise, but make sure you're not just completely snowed by the projected keyword returns being higher on a cheaper property, because number one, you run the numbers, but those numbers mean nothing if you can't sustain them. So you want to make sure you're in a situation where you can feasibly sustain the projected numbers, because if you can project numbers all day long until the cows come home, but if you never actually get that income, it's pointless. So make sure you're clear on that and make sure you understand the risk so you know what you're getting into.